Sometimes, friends, we just want to go home. At the end of a long day, whether we have worked hard or hardly worked, sometimes we just want to go home. We want to go back to that place of familiarity, of comfort, of peace, back to that place where we can fix a meal, or soak in a tub, or read a book, or all three go probably not together. Sometimes we just want to go home. Granted, we aren't always prepared for what we will come home to. We could probably all recall times when we've either literally or figuratively come home to a mess. Sometimes it's the same one we left, and sometimes it's not. But even given this existential uncertainty over its state, we know in our hearts that that young Canton, Dorothy, got it right when she proclaimed, "There's no place like home." Friends, it's true. There's no place like home. The only trouble is, not all of us live there. We may know of it, we may have visited once, but we don't all reside there. As we know all too well, there's a difference between having a roof over our head and having a home. And whether we like it or not, there are countless ways that a dwelling place can be robbed of its status as a home. Sometimes this comes as a result of abuse. When we constantly face the threat of violence to ourselves or to those we love, we can lose our way home. Sometimes this comes as the result of pain. When we live in a place of suffering, either of ourselves or of our loved ones, we can lose our way home. Sometimes this comes as a result of loss. When we no longer share the same dwelling place as those we love, sometimes we can lose our way home. The truth is, friends, there are any number of ways we can lose our way home. But as a people of faith, we know that there is only one sure way to find it again. Friends, the way home is the way of life. The way home is the way of the gospel, or perhaps most simply put, the way home is the way of love. And so today, on this day of remembrance and homecoming, after having spent 10 years processing the abuse, the pain, and the loss of September 11th, 10 years trying to find our way back to that place of familiarity, of comfort, of peace, let's pause for a moment together so that we might reorient our maps with the promise of the gospel in the hope that we just might, with some luck, find our way back home. Now, any navigator will tell us that before we can figure out the way forward, we first have to know where we are. And in those moments when we don't know our current place, it sometimes helps to consider the last place we knew where we were for sure. Certainly September 11th, 2001 is one of those places. The truth is, September 11th is a day that most of us are able to remember with amazing detail. Even if we wanted to forget it, we likely couldn't. We know what we were doing, who we were doing it with, and what we were feeling in those moments when the planes hit those towers. Even those of us who were too young to have recognized exactly what was going on surely understood that something was happening. And whether they like it or not, those who have been born after will eventually be forced to orient themselves based upon the events of that day. At its most basic, it was a day on which 2,819 human beings, children of God, never returned home. Fathers and mothers, sons and daughters, children and adults, Jews and Christians and Muslims, police officers, pilots, firefighters, military personnel, and countless others, too many others, were robbed of the chance to return home. But if we're honest, we know that they were not the only people who didn't return home that day. If, as we have already acknowledged, abuse and pain and loss have a way of making us lose our way home, then we should probably recognize that many of us, perhaps our whole nation, lost its home that day. If before 9/11 we had a tendency to see the world in black and white, none of us were quite prepared for the full-color immersion that we received as a result of that day. And like the young Kansan had been trying to tell us, sometimes it's only when we start to see the world in full color that we realize we're not in Kansas anymore. The truth is, after September 11th, many of us, if not most of us, lost that feeling of familiarity, of comfort, of peace. We started to see the world and our surroundings differently. We didn't have to have been in the towers or at the Pentagon to have looked at our neighbors in a new light, to have been a little more wary of those who are different from us. We know that the path we have traveled since that day has had its ups and downs. As a nation, we've entered 2 wars that we would arguably not have been involved in if it were not for the events of that day. Regardless of whether we believe these wars were necessary or not, we should all acknowledge that as a result of them, many others, soldiers and civilians, Afghans and Iraqis, also never returned home. Friends, we all had different reactions to that day. Some of them good, and some of them bad. At our worst, we looked with trepidation at our neighbors. At our best, we reminded each other what a neighbor is. At our worst, we used the events of that day perpetrated by a few tragically misguided zealots as a way of justifying intolerance towards an entire faith of people who pray to the same God of Abraham we proclaim. At our best, we have used that day as a reminder that the gospel calls us not to stop with our own familiarity, our own comfort, or our own peace, but compels us to work toward a world in which all can share those trappings of home. Friends, we know where we were on that day. And yes, in the days and years since, we have all gone our separate ways. But the good news is that remarkably, somehow, serendipitously, perhaps miraculously, despite our disparate wanderings, we all managed to find our way here today. And since we're here, friends, in this place of worship, in this home of sorts, perhaps we can agree between ourselves to not forget the events of September 11th and the people who lost their lives as a result, but to honor them by perhaps finally, at long last, returning home. Friends, let's go home. Though we might have all arrived in this place from different directions today, on this homecoming Sunday, we have a chance to leave here oriented towards one. Today, friends, we begin our journey home. And although the path ahead is not marked with yellow bricks, we are fortunate enough to have a gospel that offers a way for even the most lost among us. Today, friends, the beloved disciple John, from his home in the early 2nd century, offers us 3 markers to help us find our way back home. 3 markers that, if we follow in earnest, can take us most of the way. The first gospel marker is one of relationship. Whatever else the gospel proclaims, at its core, it's about relationship. And it begins with our relationship with God, just as the opening story in our entire Bible speaks about our very creation as being in the image of God. Our passage today opens with Jesus proclaiming, "I will not leave you orphaned." I will not leave you orphaned. In the passage, Jesus is preparing the disciples for his death, but the message without family or friends or fellowship. Here, Jesus is reminding us, as he does throughout the Gospels, that we believe in a God who never leaves us alone. Again, it doesn't mean that we won't deal with pain. We will. But the promise of the Gospel is that we won't be alone in the midst of it. Every once in a while in life, we are lucky enough to be reminded of what this kind of presence looks like. Captain Cady Brown was on the 44th floor of the North Tower of the World Trade Center when the South Tower collapsed. Shortly after the other tower fell, his commanding officer ordered he and his company to get out of the tower. His reply was simple and tragic. I refuse the order. He said, I refuse the order. I'm up here on the 44th floor and I've got too many burnt people with me. I'm not leaving them. When the tower fell, Captain Brown and all of the people he was treating perished. But friends, they were not alone. Friends, the gospel doesn't promise a life free of pain or death or disease. All of those things are a part of the freedom that God gives us to live in this world. No, what the gospel promises is that no matter how grim the situation, no matter how challenging life becomes, we are not alone. Friends, you are not alone. I will not leave you orphaned. The second gospel marker is one of direction. Jesus says to his disciples and in turn to us, they who have my commandments and keep them are those who love me. And those who love me will be loved by my Father, and I will love them. In other words, he begins by promising that there's nothing we can do to change our relationship with God. We are children of God, whether we like it or not, young and old, black and white, rich and poor, gay and straight, male and female. We are children of God. But once we recognize that relationship, once we've experienced the life-transforming grace of Jesus Christ, our only fitting response, indeed our only response, is to try and live like Christ commanded. And in case we're wondering which commandment he's referring to, the beloved disciple reminds us the commandment in the Gospel of John is simply this: love one another. In other words, the second gospel marker toward home is the same as the first. It's one of relationships. But it says that because we have a relationship with God, we also have a responsibility to treat others like it. We are called to love one another. Full stop. Not if they look like, smell like, speak like, pray like, or feel like us. No, we are called to love one another, period, or rather, exclamation point. Friends, how might the past 10 years have been different if we had remembered this commandment? How are we called to treat our Muslim brothers and sisters in light of 9/11? Love one another. How should we respond to violence and bigotry in our own communities? Love one another. How are we supposed to move forward without the security and comfort of home? Love one another. We don't always know how to do it, but we know that we have to. That's what makes being a Christian hard. It means acknowledging that because we are all children of God, we have a responsibility for treating each other like it. And it's only when we do that that we can find our way home. Jesus says, those who keep my word, and my Father will love them, and we will come to them, and we will make our home in them. And we will come to them and make our home in them. Friends, when we live out the call of the gospel to love one another, we are always at home. We might not have a roof over our heads. We might not be someplace familiar, and we might not be comfortable, but we will always be home. When we love one another, God makes God's home with us. Do you see? We become the place where others find God. We are the home for God. And once we do that, then that final mile marker is not too far off. The final gospel marker today is one of peace. Peace I leave with you. My peace I give to you. I do not give as the world gives. Do not let your hearts be troubled, neither let them be afraid. As one theologian I call father-in-law says, peace is not so much the absence of conflict as it is the awareness of love. Peace, friends, is the awareness of love. We can find peace and through it home in that knowledge and promise that we are loved. Friends, you are loved. Like Captain Brown, Captain J. Jonas was in the North Tower when the South Tower collapsed. He and his men were attempting to help an injured woman down from the 24th floor when they got the call to leave the building. They got as far as the 4th floor when the tower collapsed. Miraculously, somehow, he, the 12 firefighters who were with him, and the woman they were helping survived. In the 10 years since that day, Captain Jonas, now Deputy Chief Jonas, has shared his story with an untold number of people. The only thing he doesn't like when he shares his story is when people come up to him and say, God must have been with you that day. It's not that he doesn't think God was there. He, in fact, knows that God was. But he doesn't like the implication. They seem to be suggesting that God somehow wasn't with those who didn't make it out. And what he has learned and where he has found peace enough to continue his work indeed is the same message we hear proclaimed in our gospel message, and it is this: God is there no matter if we make it out or not. As we remind each other Sunday after Sunday, though we know not what a day may bring, we know that the hour for serving is now. Today, friends, is Homecoming Sunday. And because we believe in a God who loves us enough to stand with us even in our most tragic moments, a God who never leaves us alone, whatever else happens, at least we know we will never be far from home. And if there's one truth we can be assured of, it is, as that Kansan said,